The world is about to become a smaller place. Soon you'll be able to travel a mile every 3 seconds.
The story of Concorde is one born of dreams that soared well beyond people's imagination. A story that started in 1956 when the Supersonic Transport Aircraft Committee was formed. When the skies were filled with the sounds of early jet engines, Anglo-French visionaries were imagining a passenger aircraft that could outrun the sound they made. An aircraft that could fly faster than a rifle bullet, covering 23 miles a minute. A joint venture between Britain's BAC and what was to become France's Aerospatiale, when in 1961 the first meetings took place between both countries. Concorde by name signified harmony and partnership between these countries. On the 2nd of March 1969, competing to get Concorde into the air, the first French prototype flew.
Nose come up to 20 degrees, she's airborne, she flies.
Concorde became a mark of what humanity could achieve when it dared to reach higher. It was the Model T Ford of supersonic aircraft for the 70s, shrinking the globe in the process, at a time when it belied technology that was available. In one fell swoop, it replaced the entire progress made in aviation since the Wright brothers in 1903. It's unlikely that anything like Concorde will ever fly again. This video offers an insight into the main reasons why Concorde was amazing. It's first necessary to look at Concorde's wing design before exploring the mechanics of the famous droop snoot. As a supersonic aircraft, Concorde of course used a slender swept-back delta wing for streamlined high-speed flight. Its wing had an OG curve, or concave to convex S-shape. Subsonic commercial aircraft often use extendable triple-slotted flaps for slow-speed flight, but Concorde didn't have space in its slender streamlined wing, so at slow speeds it had to generate lift by other means. It did this by increasing the angle of attack of the wing to the airflow and creating vortex lift. This type of lift is formed as air separates over the top of the wing, creating faster moving swirling vortices. These vortices created lower static pressure on the upper wing surface relative to higher static pressure on the lower surface by faster moving air. So this higher angle of attack is why Concorde had to lower its nose to 5 degrees for takeoff and 12.5 degrees on approach so that the pilots could see the runway. Built into the nose was the visor, which functioned to protect the main windscreens from intense friction heating at Mach 2, but it could be lowered to aid visibility on landing and takeoff. The mechanism worked by having independent actuators to move the nose and visor, with the nose hinged to the fuselage. The nose and visor was secured in the up position by up locks, which disengaged when initially moving the visor down, and then the nose. But the pilot got a visual warning of disengagement from a display panel next to the visor nose selector switch, and help by way of various micro switches, that the correct movement was engaged. The visor itself was moved by a series of operating and tracking legs and an A-frame which moved along a curved visor rail. When the nose moved down, it was supported by the twin nose actuators, but if both normal and standby hydraulic systems had failed, then it was possible for the pilots to use a mechanical linkage to let the nose fall under gravitational and aerodynamic loads. Concorde is known for using Rolls-Royce Olympus 593 turbojet engines. Turbojets won the day for Concorde because of no frontal fan area to reduce drag at supersonic speeds. In contrast to turbofans, turbojets work more like a conventional jet engine to almost rocket propel an aircraft along. At takeoff and when going through the sound barrier, Concorde used afterburners or reheats, which essentially squirt fuel into exhaust gases. This is to exploit the thrust pressure of unspent oxygen going through the engine. But to understand the functionality of Concorde's twin intake ramps and primary and secondary engine nozzles is also to understand how air moves through converging and diverging ducts. When subsonic air moves through a converging duct, it speeds up, and conversely it slows down when diverging. The opposite is true for supersonic air, which, without getting into a physics lesson, is to do with compressible flow and varying air density at different speeds. Concorde's front intakes, rear nozzles, and other engine components worked in different configurations to exploit this principle. At takeoff, the aim was to get as much air through the engine intake as possible, forming a diverging duct at that point and not slowing the subsonic air. So the two air intake ramps were up at the front of each of Concorde's square intakes. To this end, an auxiliary inlet vane was open, which had the added effect of letting in as much air as possible. Also, secondary air doors were closed to direct air into the engine. But the primary nozzles, located in the jet pipe and being a ring of petals opened or closed by pneumatic jacks, were partly closed to help. However, Concorde's rear eyelid doors or buckets, forming the secondary nozzles, were partly closed to form a speeding up converging duct. During supersonic flight, the opposite would happen. The intake ramps would both lower, creating a shock wave and slowing the supersonic air to Mach 0.5 so that the engine could use it. This was necessary, of course, since jet engines can't deal with supersonic air for reasons of combustion and the effect of damaging shock waves. At the rear of the engine, the primary and secondary nozzles would both be open as far as possible, forming a diverging duct and not choking air going through the engine. Concorde's rear buckets also worked as thrust reversers, much like a 737-200s did. Concorde's fuel tanks not only had a secondary function of controlling the position of its centre of gravity, but they also acted as heat sinks to absorb kinetic skin heating at supersonic speeds. The aircraft used 13 fuel tanks comprising engine feed tanks that fed fuel to the Olympus engines and transfer tanks which topped up the feed tanks. These tanks were positioned symmetrically about the centre of gravity, such that using fuel didn't affect Concorde's balance. But it was the forward and aft trim tanks that allowed Concorde to pump fuel back and forth between these tanks, and of course distribute fuel to the transfer tanks as needed. The principle is that the shock waves associated to supersonic flight pushes the centre of pressure along the wing backwards, the point through which the total lift of the aircraft operates. It could be as much as 6 feet rearward with Concorde. But because the aircraft's centre of gravity stayed in the same place, this rearward movement in the centre of pressure causes a misalignment between these forces. Therefore, there was a tendency for the nose to drop. Normally an aircraft would trim this out with a slight upward movement of the elevator located on the tailplane. Concorde didn't have a tailplane, of course, but it could still use its elevons to trim out these forces, so this wasn't a problem. Elevons act as elevators which have pitch function, but also as ailerons with roll capability, but they are coupled together in one control surface, typically where there is no tailplane. But the issue is that this trim deflection could cause drag at supersonic speeds. So the pumping of fuel back and forth solved this problem, mitigating the need for aerodynamic control and using weight distribution instead. That's why, before takeoff, the flight engineer would pump fuel from the forward trim tanks to the aft trim tanks in preparation for supersonic flight, and the opposite happened before landing. Not only was this great for the pilots because little use of pitch trim meant very accurate flying, but another benefit was in being able to put Concorde a little out of trim when landing and taking off. Specifically, the elevons would go down to counteract the rearward weight shift and increase the camber of the wing necessary for slow flight.
Even at 185 tons, you're pushed into the back of your seat.
3, 2, 1, now.
Concorde's afterburners or reheats did increase thrust by around 20% on takeoff, but amazingly, in the name of performance, as much as a ton of fuel could be consumed by 1,000 feet. Such was its performance, it had a fuel tank capacity of 119,000 litres to cope with around 4 hours of flight. To put that into perspective, this contrasts with an Airbus A350, which has a similar tank capacity, but which can stay up in the air for around 17 to 18 hours. One understands then why commercial pilots often dubbed Concorde as the sports car of the sky, though it didn't actually need its afterburners after going through the sound barrier, the so-called ability to supercruise. Concorde's afterburner worked by spraying high-pressure fuel from a spray ring towards another ring behind called an anvil. The fuel was then blown back by the jet stream and atomised, passing over the spray ring and over a semicircular ring mounted at the rear of the afterburner called a flame holder. As in its name, its role was to essentially hold the flame. Ignition was provided by a reheat igniter tube which fed the spray ring with a 15 kilovolt arc mixed with engine compressor air. To kick in, the afterburner needed the N1 low pressure compressor stage of the engines to be at 81% or more. Once the reheats lit, which was often visible in many a Concorde takeoff, higher fuel scheduling rates were sent to the afterburner rings to maximise thrust. Concorde was mainly the preserve of the rich and famous, granted, but at its outset it exuded a time where things were done rather differently before and after boarding. But it did also get enjoyed by everyday folks, particularly as many flights were chartered.
Doing the aisle at the rear of the cabin.
Oh, yes.
Cheers.
Looking at some of the old 70s films, you can't help think that the politeness of the crews wasn't so much put on for the cameras, but represented this golden age of flight where flying was still relatively new. Luxurious Concorde airport lounges as a pre-build up to an experience where passengers would take off at 250 knots and see the curvature of the Earth at 60,000 feet was totally unmatched. And BA pilots' catchphrase to passengers flying through the sound barrier, "No bumps, no bangs, just Concorde," no doubt added to this emotional journey of flying on this aircraft.
It was a vehicle that was designed for one thing and one thing only, and that was to fly at twice the speed of sound.
There was a real atmosphere of euphoria in the cabin. There was like a little bit of a feeling as you went supersonic and you went through the speed of sound.
Delicate canapes with fine champagne preceded the meal selection on a typical Atlantic crossing. Customers might then expect a starter of fresh fruits and salmon with a main meal of fillet of Angus beef, served with pricey French Grand Cru red wines. But Concorde actually had 7 compact galleys on board despite the confined space. And forgetting the thrills, business people never lost time of, well, not losing time. You could be in London at 10 AM and New York at 10 AM, and never has anyone found a way of being in 2 places at once. The ability to fly over the Atlantic and back before a single one-way subsonic journey creates a lump in the throat in the current subsonic climate. It's sad that Concorde's life was prematurely cut short by 9/11 and the Paris crash. It has to be said that initially it was economically unsound, funded by French and British taxpayers. However, as aviation lovers, we are glad that it went ahead. There is something rather emotional about looking at an aircraft that combined technological brilliance and invoking an astoundingly beautiful swan-like appearance. It's not unreasonable to look upon Concorde as a miracle. Concorde died at the age of 34, but what will remain is the myth and mystique of what was, in aviation terms, a beautiful white bird. Making documentaries like this takes months of work all by myself, so I just wanted to ask a favour. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so I can keep on making content. If you want to show your appreciation for the work that went into this video, head over to my Buy Me a Coffee page. The link is in the description. Thanks again and see you in the next video.